7 words spoken on live radio by the United States Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra. 7 words that will be studied in diplomatic academies for decades as a textbook example of how not to conduct international relations. We don't need Canada, he said it out loud. On the record. Into a microphone, as if he was stating a fact, not revealing a fantasy. And while he was saying it, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney was touching down in Doha, Qatar, becoming the first sitting Canadian leader to ever visit the Gulf state. He walked off the plane, shook hands with the emir, and walked away with commitments for billions in sovereign wealth investment into Canadian infrastructure. That same week, Ottawa quietly slashed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to just 6%, opening the door for up to 49,000 EVs to flow north. Vehicles America had locked out with its own 100% tariff wall. So let me be absolutely clear about what happened here. On one side, a diplomat telling the world America doesn't need its neighbor. On the other side, that neighbor signing deals with Asia, locking in capital from the Gulf, and rerouting its own economic future in real time. This wasn't a clash of policies. This was a collision of competence and delusion. And today, we're going to break down the 7 words that just cost the United States more than any tariff ever could. We're going to expose the 3 catastrophic assumptions Washington made, and why each one is now detonating in slow motion. And we're going to show you the infrastructure, the contracts, and the ships already sailing that prove Canada isn't just leaving the American orbit. It's already left. Washington just hasn't looked up from its radio interview. Let's start with Hoekstra himself, former congressman, Trump loyalist, current ambassador to Canada, and apparently a man who believes diplomacy is about who can sound toughest in a morning radio hit. But here's the thing about power. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. China doesn't do radio interviews saying, "We don't need rare earths." The United States, in its unipolar heyday, never felt compelled to reassure itself out loud that its allies were dependent. Confidence doesn't explain. It just is. The moment you say, "We don't need you," you've already admitted 3 things. 1, you're worried they might leave. 2, you're trying to convince yourself they won't. 3, you have no better move. That interview wasn't strength. It was a tell. And every trade negotiator, every sovereign wealth fund manager, every geopolitical analyst watching that clip heard it instantly. What they heard wasn't "America is powerful." What they heard was "America is anxious." And anxiety in global capital markets reprices risk immediately. Washington's first assumption was simple. Canada couldn't diversify. Too integrated, too dependent, nowhere else to go. This assumption was always arrogant, but until recently, it was also true. Not anymore. Let me show you what happened in the 90 days before Hoekstra opened his mouth. Deal 1, Germany. Canada signed a landmark green hydrogen agreement with Berlin. Not a memorandum of understanding, a binding multi-year supply deal. Canadian energy produced in Atlantic Canada shipped directly to Europe, bypassing the United States entirely. Deal 2, China. The EV tariff reduction from 100% to 6%. This isn't symbolic, this is structural. 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles annually entering the North American market not through Los Angeles or New York, but through Vancouver and Halifax. Why? Because Canada realized something Washington didn't. If you can't compete with China, partner with them. Use their overcapacity to your advantage. Build distribution, servicing, and eventually manufacturing around their supply chain. Deal 3, Qatar, a sitting Canadian Prime Minister, Doha, sovereign wealth commitments. This isn't about one meeting. This is about a strategic pivot toward Gulf capital that has been quietly underway for years. The Qatar Investment Authority, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, these are among the largest, most sophisticated pools of capital on Earth, and they are now being systematically courted by Ottawa to fund Canadian ports, pipelines, and critical mineral projects. So here's the question. Washington should have asked itself, but didn't. If Canada had nowhere else to go, why is it suddenly everywhere? The second assumption was even more dangerous, that pressure works faster than adaptation. Washington looked at its playbook, tariffs, threats, public dismissals, and assumed Canada would flinch. It's worked before. Smaller economies buckle under U.S. pressure. They negotiate, they concede. But Canada didn't flinch. Instead, it absorbed the shock, extended its timelines, and quietly built substitutes. Here's what that looked like operationally. Electricity. The northeastern United States, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, runs on Quebec's hydroelectricity. Not partially, physically dependent. There is no backup, there is no spare capacity. There is no grid-scale battery storage ready to replace 15% of the region's power overnight. If Canada redirects even a fraction of that power eastward to support its own industrial expansion or to export to Europe as green electrons, those states don't experience a price hike. They experience a crisis. Uranium. America's nuclear fleet, which provides nearly 20% of its electricity, relies heavily on Canadian uranium. It's not just about fuel, it's about enrichment contracts, long-term reliability, and safety certification. You can't swap out nuclear fuel rods on a quarterly earnings cycle. Fertilizer. American agriculture depends on Canadian potash. Period. There is no domestic substitute at scale. There is no near-term alternative supplier. And yet the ambassador said, with a straight face, we don't need them. But here's where we move from theory to steel and concrete. Because the most devastating proof that Canada has already left the American orbit isn't in a trade deal or a diplomatic communique. It's on the coast of British Columbia. LNG Canada. This is the largest energy infrastructure project in Canadian history. $40 billion. First cargo shipped in June 2024. Over 25 shipments since then. Destination, Asia. Let me repeat that. Canadian natural gas extracted from the ground, liquefied on Canadian shores, loaded onto Canadian chartered vessels, and sold to Japanese and Korean utilities, without ever touching the United States. This terminal isn't a proposal, it's not a PowerPoint slide, it's operational, it's exporting, it's making money. And it's only the beginning. Cedar LNG, wood fiber LNG. A potential phase 2 expansion that would double LNG Canada's capacity, all under construction or approved, all funded by Asian and Middle Eastern capital, all designed to bypass American infrastructure permanently. This is what decoupling actually looks like. It's not a speech. It's a supply chain physically rerouted, port by port, pipeline by pipeline, contract by contract. And here's the irreversible truth. Once infrastructure is built this way, it doesn't revert. You don't decommission a $40 billion terminal because a new administration asks nicely. You don't tear up long-term supply contracts with Asian utilities because the ambassador regrets his radio appearance. The drift is structural, and it's permanent. But the most dangerous consequence for Washington isn't what Canada does. It's what Canada demonstrates. Every middle power is watching Ottawa right now. Mexico, Australia, South Korea, Vietnam, the Europeans. And they're all asking the same question. If Canada can diversify without getting crushed, why can't we? For 70 years, the American led order rested on an unspoken assumption: allies don't leave. They complain, they negotiate, they extract concessions, but they don't actually build alternatives to American power. Canada just proved that assumption is dead. And once one country proves it, others follow. Mexico is already reevaluating its energy dependency on the U.S. Southwest. Australia is watching how Canada courts Chinese capital while managing security tensions. Germany is studying the Canada model of energy diversification. The damage isn't measured in tariffs or trade balances, it's measured in trust. And trust, once fractured, doesn't repair on a political timetable. So let's return to those 7 words. We don't need Canada. Hoekstra thought he was projecting strength. Instead, he revealed weakness. He thought he was dismissing a dependent. Instead, he confirmed to the world that the United States no longer understands its own supply chain, its own vulnerabilities, or its own alliances. Canada, meanwhile, said nothing. It didn't need to. It had the contracts. It had the ships. It had the sovereign wealth commitments. It had an LNG terminal already sending gas to Asia, while Washington was still rehearsing its talking points. That's the difference between posturing and power. The old game was whoever sounds tougher wins. The new game is whoever has more options doesn't need to say anything at all. Canada figured that out. And by the time Washington realizes what happened, really realizes it, the ports will be expanded. The pipelines will be flowing east and west, not south. The capital will be locked in. The trade routes will be permanent. This isn't a policy failure, this is a structural shift, and it's already underway. What do you think? Was Hoekstra's statement a catastrophic diplomatic blunder or just an honest reflection of how Washington really sees its allies? Can the United States reverse this drift, or is the diversification of Canada and every other middle power now inevitable? Let me know in the comments. If you want to track these geopolitical shifts before they hit the headlines, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We're watching the signals the rest of the world misses.